book of Acts, you know that Luke will travel with Paul as he answers the Macedonian call, which means he goes to Philippi then with Paul. And then seemingly, Luke stays in Philippi as Paul moves on. Now, again, this is some speculation involved here, but what we find is that we've got the we, and then it becomes the they again, and the them. And then the we starts again. So somewhere along the line, it seems that maybe Luke stayed somewhere where Paul went on, and then he rejoins with Paul later on. In fact, in chapter 17, verse 1, when Paul leaves Philippi, it seems that he stays because it becomes the thee. But when Paul comes back to Troas in Acts chapter 20, all of a sudden it becomes us we again. And so perhaps maybe Paul picked up Luke somewhere along the line there somewhere. But possibly Paul was dealing with some type of physical malaise. That in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 9, he even says that he thought he was going to die of it. And it could be that Luke became his personal physician. Now again, this is speculative, but I think there's some evidence that might lean towards that being the case here. The question I would ask is, why would a physician, a doctor who made a good living back then, just like they do today, why would he leave his practice and follow a guy like Paul to all these different places? Well, let me give you maybe a reason. Go to Acts chapter 20. Go to Acts chapter 20. Let me give you, again, if we're going to speculate a little bit, let me give you something to speculate over here. Let me give you something to think about. Acts chapter 20 is when Paul preaches in Troas, when he comes back through there. In Acts chapter 20, it says in verse 9, and in the window sat a young man. This is Paul, he's preaching, who was sinking into deep sleep. He overcome by the sleep, and as Paul continued speaking, he fell down from the third story and was taken up dead. Verse 10, but Paul went down, fell on him, and embraced him, saying, and said, do not trouble yourself, for his life is in him. Now when he had come up, they had broken bread and eaten, and taken a long while, even till daybreak, he departed. And they brought the young man in alive, and they were not a little comforted. Luke is a physician. A young man falls out of a window. He's dead. Luke cannot do nothing for that young man. Paul raises the young man, restores his life. Now again, speculative. I think that maybe Luke was impressed by what he saw. And he saw something in a man that he knew he couldn't do. And here's a man that's been preaching, and Paul, and again, Luke had already followed him somewhat, but he stayed somewhere and didn't go on. But from then on, it seems that Luke was always by Paul's side. Maybe because of what he saw down there in Troas in Acts chapter 20. And again, I don't know. But I do know this. He was a doctor, and his writings indicate the fact that he was a physician, somebody of great learning. His books, the two books that he wrote, are full of medical terms and language that a doctor would use. Has anybody ever heard of the book, The Medical Language of Luke, written by a man by the name of William Holbert? I had not heard of this book until just recently. It's been out for a long time. I forget when it was actually first published. But in this book, this author lists, and then he identifies 400 words that Luke uses in his writings that were also found amongst the medical journals and used by doctors in the first century. That Luke was using words and terms that were very familiar to a doctor and that he would incorporate into his writings. And let me show you one of those instances here. Look in Matthew chapter 19. Matthew chapter 19 or Mark chapter 10, wherever you're at. The story of Christ telling about the rich man and how hard it is for a rich man to do what? It's like a camel what? Trying to pass through the eye of a needle, okay? We remember that story as Matthew and Mark talks about it, all right? Luke also talks about what Christ says there. It's found over in Luke chapter 18, verse 25, about the rich man, the difficulty of a rich man passing through the eye of a needle. Big deal. I've read that thing probably 1,000 times, and you have too. You just go on to the next passage. But here's the thing that distinguishes Luke from Matthew and Mark. When Matthew and Mark wrote the word needle, they use the word that is associated with sewing. You have your sewing needles, all right? They use that word of sewing. When Luke wrote it, he used the Greek word for suture, which is a what? What's a suture? Stitch. Yeah, stitch. Yeah, something that a doctor would use. And so he used the word suture instead of the word needle. And so here you've got Luke's, doctoring comes out. His medical background is seemingly coming into his writings here. I think that's interesting that he would use that. Doctors use sutures, and and people like we use needles to sew things up. There are 5 healings, miracles in the book of Luke that are not found in the other Gospels. Let me give you those 5 here. One involves, of course, raising of a widow's son. That's found in Luke chapter 7. The widow of Naam, his son was raised by Christ. That's not found anywhere else. Luke chapter 13, the woman with the spirit of infirmity for 18 years. Luke chapter 14, a man with dropsy, not found anywhere else. Luke chapter 17, the 10 lepers. Christ healing those lepers, the one who comes back, not found anywhere else. Luke chapter 22, the restoration of the ear of the high priest that was cut off by Peter. Though we have the story mentioned, but Luke talks about that restoration that takes place there. And so again, I think we see that the doctor coming out at him and referring to things that the others left off. Another thing that Dr. Luke does, and I'm glad he does this, is that Luke makes a distinction between demon possession and disease. Now, why that is important, because the ancients really did not know what to do with demon possession. And some thought what demon possession actually was some type of physical ailment that they just didn't really have knowledge of, terminology to explain that. And so we just throw that in, demon possession. That a common physical thing may be then, just a physical ailment. Well, that's a demon possession. Look in Luke chapter 6, verse 17. Let me show you where he makes the distinction here. Luke chapter 16, verse 17. Chapter 6, verse 17. And he went down with them and stood in on a level place with the crowd of disciples and great multitude of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and from the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon, who came to hear him and be healed of their diseases, as well as those who were tormented with unclean spirits, and they were healed. And so you've got a distinction. I think Matthew makes some reference to this also, but you've got a distinction drawn there between those with diseases. I think as Matthew's account talks about the epileptic and what have you. Luke helps us to understand, certainly, that Christ is the master of all. But here's something that maybe we don't think about when it comes to Luke. And this is very important. Luke was a scientist. He was a scientist. Have you ever thought about that a doctor is also a scientist? What's a scientist do? Well, here's what a scientist does. A scientist, he looks at data, doesn't he? And he tests the data, and then he tells others about what that test